welcome. The stage is
Thank you,
yours.
Karin. Thank you so much. Thank you, Karin. And Karin could have almost said anything about me then, and I just trust the bit in English was actually what was said in Swedish in the introduction. Can I say I'm delighted to be here today, and I thank you for the warm invitation and what's a wonderful group of people here in fantastic facilities here at Chalmers University. Today, though, is a special day in Australia and in New Zealand, and I really wanted to recognise that up front because for the first time in the year, my inbox had about 10 emails, 5 of which were auto-generated by, please put your electronic signature on this for staffing, and 3 or 4 or 5 were from international colleagues. So today is the day that celebrates the landing of Australian and New Zealand forces at Gallipoli on the peninsula in Turkey. ANZAC is Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, and I want to recognise the day because Australia and New Zealand are absolutely in a state of respect, if you like, and celebration, not for war, but for the celebration of peace that followed World War I. And to put in perspective, in Australia in 1914, the population was less than 5 million, okay? So today it's 24 million. So I'm sort of giving a bit of a context of growth here and some of the things that we'll talk about in a minute. But 1 in 10 peoples, and most of them were men, so almost 1 in 5 men volunteered to go to war, and 1 in 7 of them were killed. 1 in 7 were killed. And of those that were not killed, 1 in 4 were wounded or imprisoned. So it was a serious event in a European war, right, for Australia on the other side of the earth to make a contribution to world peace. And in World War II, 1 million Australians were at war, and a good proportion of them here in Europe. So there is a long-standing link between Australia and Europe. There is a long-standing link between Australia and Sweden, and I'm delighted that over the past 15 years to have been able to be part of that. But today in France is the opening of an Australian museum recognising the hundreds of thousands of Australians that were killed in the battlefields of World War I. And the emblem of Anzac Day is the poppy, the red poppy flower that springs up in the spring in the fields of France. 1 year ago, my colleague and friend Daniel Mornson, who's a BIM strategist at Zinka BIM, and I, together with 50,000 people, joined those paying respect on the hill in Kings Park in Perth. 50,000 people in one capital city, probably 100,000 people in Melbourne, and across the country, I would estimate at least half the population involved in dawn services around 5 a.m. this morning. So I just wanted to put that on the record, and today is a national holiday in Australia, but I'm pleased to be here today, of course, speaking with you. But I really wanted to put that on the record in terms of the sincerity of today. Moving on, the presentation Collaborating Towards a Sustainable Built Environment, an International Outlook, will, as Karin's introduced, look at a couple of things that are happening in Australia and internationally, and setting a little bit of a perspective of some of the things that I see around the globe. And I wanted to put in perspective where we are in Australia. In Perth, where the little orange dot is in the same time zone, plus or minus 2 hours, of 60% of the world's population. So if we go north from Perth, people call Perth the most isolated city in the world. Perth is in the most populous time zone in the world, and it's the only Australian capital that has common time zone with Europe in terms of a business day. So it is the connection to Asia, and it's the most easy connection in terms of Europe, being 6 hours behind Sweden. And in terms of what it looks like, this is a day, a typical day, sun shining, 24 degrees today, with a minimum of about 15 in the autumn. So very similar to Sweden. Not. And what's happening here? The campus of Bentley, where the university is. It's interesting. That is interesting. But that's the campus of Curtin University is 6 kilometres from the city centre. So we can see the Swan River there. It's about 1 kilometre across in the river, and a high-rise city that spreads a little like an American city, and a population of about 2 million in Perth. And it's the 4th largest city in Australia. Highly urbanised, and I'll talk about some of the comparisons in a moment. Curtin University is Australia's largest university, the largest university in Western Australia. 60,000 students, 8 campuses going on 9. They're just opening a campus in Dubai. So it's a large campus in a city of universities, 5 universities in Perth. And to put in perspective the scale, if we think about where Australia would be plotted in Europe, if we go from, say, Kiruna down to Turkey, it's about the distance from Perth to Brisbane. We run a national centre with offices in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Perth. So typically once a month, for a week a month, I would travel from Perth to Brisbane and Sydney, or Perth from Sydney and Melbourne, travelling, more or less from, say, Gothenburg to Turkey or into Syria. Well, let's not travel to Syria, but it's a long way, 4,000 kilometres east to west, 3,000 kilometres from north to south in round numbers. Just putting a perspective to some of the comparisons between the Nordic countries and Australia, because I've suggested in my introduction that there's some similarities and long-term links. If we think about population, it's probably not one of those. We're probably double and a bit of what Sweden is, and significantly larger, of course, than your former colonies in Finland and Norway, and USA I've put in there. Population density, much lower, but city, the urbanisation is very similar. 80% of people in Australia live in cities. It's not dissimilar to Sweden in that sense. Unemployment is around about the same, more or less. And in the, there are measures of standards of living. In terms of the Human Development Report, we're each in the top 10. I mean, disregarding Finland there for a minute, sorry Finns, but if we think about places where people like to live and high standard of living, Sweden, Norway, Australia and the US are in the top few. Now this brings into account some things like quality of infrastructure, quality of labour, when we talk about GDP per head, the value of innovations like automation, the importance of things like health and safety, the importance of things like working hours and balance of life, or quality of life and balance, work-life balance. So I'm suggesting that there are similar sorts of national conditions, and though you're cold, we can get pretty hot. So there are similar climatic extremes that have challenges when it comes to building standards, thermal comfort, and productivity, for example, in extreme climate conditions. So my suggestion is there's a lot that we can learn from each other, and I guess that's the message that I wanted to leave from this slide. I wanted to give a little bit of a background on the Sustainable Built Environment National Research Centre, SBE, and we're a centre where we actually act as an interface or a broker between industry, government and researchers. And in that sense, we're about infrastructure and buildings. We work, if you like, in housing, buildings and infrastructure, and through the life cycle. So we don't specialise precisely in design, but we look at design, construction and asset management as a supply chain. And we work with our industry partners, not dissimilar to most of you here today, to add value to those businesses. We've been going 22 years. In 1996, we formed an alliance with the CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, and here we are today with funding in place to 2021. So we've come through an era of federal funding, government funding in the earlier stages from 2001 to 2010, and since those embryonic days of having government funding, we've now branched into having a fully funded industry centre. Around about $2 million a year, so 14 million kroner per year, and we work across 3 integrated research programs. In essence, we've used the triple bottom line analogy, though we can variously look at different ways of categorising the world. We think it's a good typology to start with. Greening the built environment, environmental, people, processes and procurement is what we call social sustainability, and productivity, particularly productivity around process improvement, is the economic sustainability thrust. We tend to work in 18-month projects, short and sharp, long enough to actually develop good relationships in a team. And I mentioned the relationships up front because we put a lot of effort and care into selecting the teams and then helping facilitate those sorts of relationship building. And we're certainly not into long-term public research. 5 years or more, blue sky research, great though it is and essential as it is in a national industry innovation system. We want to work around 18-month projects that works on activities that are showing promise from blue sky research and taking them into practice in a period where it minimises the risk and the time and the sense of the attention span, I suspect, in some of our industry and government partners, and we work in what we call that sweet spot. We have very strong embedded industry leadership at the project level, at the research committee level, the organisation or the committee that decides on which projects to support and every 3 months evaluates their progress, and at the governing board. So an independent industry chair with an industry majority in a board of 10, so a relatively small board. Research and utilisation committee, an industry chair with an industry majority where project leaders, for example, are there by invitation to present, but they, if we ever come to a vote, which we don't, but they don't have voting rights. And research projects where we have an industry project steering group chair. And so what we seek to do at a project level is to run them reasonably independently once they're established, with an industry chair who would be an influential, often semi-retired industry leader who would have some kudos in industry and the ability and preparedness to talk to industry and to the media about the projects that are happening and their commitment to them. So the word commitment from project steering group chair and the team itself is important. The project steering group chair, for example, on a project that is on autonomous vehicles and their application into infrastructure and how the infrastructure might change, is the former Commissioner for Main Roads, so the Chief of Traffic Verket, for example, here. And that person has been in that role for 4.5 years and has just agreed happily to take on the next 18-month project. But he also is the former Chancellor, the President of the university, and also a former Governor of Western Australia. So those are the sorts of people that we want to be able to have speaking in the media about our projects, because if I talk about it in the media, or our project leaders from universities talk about it, they may say, oh, another self-serving industry, academic who's looking for some relevance in this world. However, if an industry person hears another respected industry person saying, and this project is really important because it's actually making a difference to the way that we think and way that we look at our industry, and we're looking towards the next decade of opportunity for change, it brings a lot more clout and a lot more respect. industry-led, I guess, is the summary there. And for those who are interested in reading Swedish, I'm sure there's plenty of you here. Some of this is described in this book from Jan Brockner here at Chalmers, from a Vinnova-sponsored book chapter in 2012. So I wanted to move on now to some of the work that we do in Sustainable Built Environment National Research Centre. In 2004, we ran a 2-year workshop around the country, Darwin in the north, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, Adelaide, Perth. Workshops in every one of those cities twice over a 2-year program, inviting industry associations. So the equivalent in this country, like your engineers, the architects group, the real estate developers and so on. And they hosted our team of industry leaders and senior researchers, understanding what it was that were the challenges or the pinch points for industry, and how in their best dreams they could see applied research making a difference. So it needed to be industry focused up front, and then what research could make a difference, and then importantly, thirdly, how they would use the outcomes of that research into practice. So we needed to see the translation of research into practice, and that survey was a piece of research in itself, and is one of the most highly referenced foresighting productions in the world, A Vision for Australia's Property and Construction Industry, and sitting behind it are the results of questionnaires, interviews and workshops carried out in conjunction with Salford University's Pro Vice-Chancellor Research at the time in Peter Brandon. And interestingly, the visions that came out of the work that we did in 2004, 2005 and 2006 are almost identical to what we find now. We do this annually now as a wake-up call, a refresher, and ensure that we've got current industry views on what's important for the next 12 or 18 months of research development. Environmentally sustainable construction, meeting client needs, improved business environment, welfare and improvement of the labour force. Now these are macro headings you'd appreciate, and spinning off them are current projects, information and communication technologies, virtual prototyping, off-site manufacture and improved processes. But you'd appreciate that those areas that are highlighted that have particularly a digital overtone are really about how do people, humans, work with technology. It's not about the technology. We don't employ IT people to actually have too much fun with their MIPS, BIPs and chips. We employ them to actually work in project teams and make work either safer or more productive. And in that sense, this slide, which I have taken from one of our partners, Oricon's Digital Futures work, is really sort of linking the technology back to humans. And if we lose that in the social sustainability current, we're missing the mark. Important to connect with politicians and make a political impact. So this is Construction 20 at Parliament House, being launched by the Minister for Industry and the Minister for Science. So science and industry coming together at a national level said this is the blueprint for construction research in Australia, and they committed to that. Their funding ran out, their commitment in dollars ran out, but of course they're morally committed now. But it's good. And they still maintain, across parties, so in a bipartisan way, they maintain the value of this document. But more importantly, they maintain the value of collaboration across industry to ensure that we're not just dreaming about academic research, that we're actually consulting with industry and making a commitment to address those issues, having project level, research committee level and board level industry support and industry leadership ensures that every 3 months our mission and our targets are being revisited. And it's a painful process sometimes, and it certainly keeps me, I'm only 30 years old, and it keeps me very active in the pursuit of what we need to do to keep these relationships alive. What I want to do now is just touch on a couple of the initiatives that we have in the social sustainability area. Health and safety, social housing, and what I call integrated project environments. Now, health and safety, we have a stream of research, and we've won awards at a national level for research into training programs and research making a difference in respect of the way that contracts are written, embedding safety practices that are based on the research of our centre. And I've got a little video that talks about FIFO, which is fly in, fly out, and DIDO, which is drive in, drive out, and the dangers around health and safety and family issues and issues to do with suicides and mental health, and how that relates to the research that we do to make sure that the people side of the industry is being well taken care of. Social housing, a stream of research that's been carried out over the last 6 years particularly, and integrated project environments. This is the BIM or digital engineering about improving processes, but more around how to ensure that the work teams, how to ensure that the work practices, how to ensure that the productivity promises from digitisation of the supply chain is actually delivered in the teams, in the human interface between machines and the delivery of projects. So, publication, I wanted to touch on as an important element of this. Not publication of academic journal articles. They are, of course, critical to the survival of our university partners, which we have around the country. But more important is the industry publication that makes its way onto the managing director's coffee table. So we put a lot of work into the final industry report, typically 20 pages, typically glossy with lots of photos, with connections to hot links or to industry, other industry reports and research reports. And sitting on the web are the research reports. But the primary product in terms of publication at a project level is the final industry report and a video. Typically a 3 or 5 minute video. This one is a 5-minute one on the challenges for the fly in, fly out, drive in, drive out workforce, impacts on health, safety and relationships. And can I say that this research carried out in 2012, 13, 14 and carried on today formed the basis of some of the Western Australian government and Queensland government's inquiry into suicides in the workplace, in the construction workforce, which is a serious issue. And this followed a project called Alcohol and Other Drugs in Construction Workforce. Important issues in terms of maintaining the social sustainability of our industry. This is I'm sorry, I've got to go up here and touch it. That's what I've got to do. The Sustainable Built Environment National Research Centre is a unique blend of industry, government and research partners who come together delivering applied research for Australian industry.
So in Australia, there is a growing demand for more fly in, fly out and drive in, drive out workers, particularly in the construction areas, which are often associated with the resource extraction industry. The purpose of this project was to examine the impacts that fly in, fly out and drive in, drive out workers faced in relation to their health, their safety and their relationships.
The important research we did in this project was really part of and formed part of and was driven by 2 major reports in this country. The federal government report in 2012 on fly in, fly out workers and interactions with home and host communities, and the very important report by WA government on suicide and mental health issues in fly in, fly out workers in WA. As I speak, the Queensland government is continuing its own inquiry into this important area. This research was underpinned by 4 objectives. The first of these was to examine the relationships between the workers themselves and their families and the home and host communities. The second was to look at psychosocial issues which had been pointed out before as elements of concern in this workforce. The third was to look at issues to do with health, safety and environmental issues on site, which were of a concern for this particular group. And the fourth was to again look in more detail with the issues of rosters, shifts, work times, job descriptions and so on, which have an impact on all of the three areas above. Our research was conducted in 3 states, Western Australia, Queensland and New South Wales. We ended up in the order of 300 questionnaire data sets. In addition to that, we had 15 focus groups across these 3 communities.
A lot of these workers found that the work was very meaningful and that they found it important. It was of value to them. Secondly, they also found that safety was a key priority for management, regardless of where they worked. The more important issues, however, lie around the family relationships. So some of the key aspects included isolation whilst working, an inability to communicate with family whilst on site, their rosters and work demands, and fatigue from travel, particularly to and from site.
So that's just an example of the communication tools that we make of with YouTube, and we have our own YouTube channel, and every project now is required to produce a 3 to 5 minute YouTube video for mass distribution, if you like, and for researchers often there's another one of 10 minutes or so which supports the project report. Industry, on the right hand side, the CEO of John Holland, which is a large Australian company before the Spaniards bought it. The head of safety in the union, the Construction Workers Union across the country, and myself at the launch of this project in Parliament House in Canberra. So we try to match those senior level political angles in working together. The integrated project environments, I wanted to put the perspective here in the last couple of moments of the absolute necessity for us to engage in digitisation of the supply chain. And you will all have heard BIM and digital engineering and how it's changing the landscape of the industry, and it is. But as we go from 2D to 3D to 5D to ND, and these jargon words, we really do need to think about how that interfaces with the working relationships within the teams, and if they're cross-disciplinary teams involving the client, the designer and the constructor, and hopefully the facility manager or asset manager, it's a different relationship and it has different stresses and challenges, and it needs different sorts of skills, and it needs a greater sense of collaboration and ability to work together and seek common outcomes. I won't go through this one. I will wrap up towards looking at the core partners. Oricon are a single, we work towards single function entities on our board. Oricon are the consultant, a global consultant, engineering and social activities. BGC, Australia's largest home builder, 30,000 homes a year, but also building residential and office accommodation, as well as roads, bridges and rail. A seriously large integrated consultancy. Government of governments of Western Australia, Queensland and New South Wales, and universities across Queensland in Griffith, Swinburne in Melbourne and Curtin. We work across about 50 other organisations who contribute at the project level, in industry associations, in local governments or municipalities, and of course at an international level, particularly working around the CIB, the International Council for Research and Innovation in Building and Construction. So we see this as a global network. It's a global challenge with industries facing similar issues here in Sweden, in the Nordic region, and in Australia and in the Pacific. And with that, I'd like to finish. Karin, on time, I trust, and welcome any comments, I guess, soon. Thank you.